Hello and welcome back, and if you've followed this channel for a while, you'll know that I'm something of a slut when it comes to brand new DIY NASs, especially as they get smaller and smaller, and having something like this in your home, business, SMB, home lab, prosumer environment or whatever is becoming increasingly unnecessary. And therefore, today I don't want to talk about this, I want to talk about this. This is the CWWK or Changwang P6. This is an X86 64-bit Intel N355 powered NAS system with 4 M.2 NVMe's, and it only measures 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by a little over 5 centimeters. This thing is minute, and I want to work out whether this thing can stand up against the big boys. In today's video, we're going to look at SSD performance, we're going to look at VMs, we're going to be looking at the individual internal and external components, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll decide whether this thing deserves your data. Now, this arrives in two different CPU profiles, both twin lake. Is the N150 quad-core CPU, but this is the 8-core. This is the i3, the N355. Now, if you go for the N150 version, it knocks out for about $195, and for $315 you get the 8-core N355 version, which is the one we're looking at today. So again, very similar CPU profiles there, and we'll talk about the CPU a bit more later on. You are effectively getting a little boost in clock speed between the two of them, and of course the additional cores, but you're not getting anything extra in terms of threads or lanes. It really is throughput and spreading itself thinner and thinner across the board. So one of the earliest questions most users are going to have about this, and we will come to that noise in a moment, by the way, one of the things that people are going to have concerns about on a device like this is heat. As this is a 4x M2 NVMe NAS system, a lot of users are going to be heavily concerned about noise generation when the system is in use. Now, the base of the system, you see that fan inside there? We removed the base. That whole base panel is a large fan-assisted aluminium heatsink there. That is our CPU heatsink there. It's built in that fan. It's not an additional. Now, the top is one giant heatsink. We'll talk about it a little bit more later on, but this is one big heatsink for our SSDs. Now, with the kit, you get several items, some of which confuse me, but we'll get to that later on. You see these screw holes here at each of the corners? That's because it does include this rather weird little fan here. If you choose to, you can attach that fan to the top and connect it to a USB port. So on the face of it, you're thinking, fair and well, that's not bad. I will highlight, this thing only has 2 USB ports on it. There's no additional USB 2s for your KVM. It really is just those 2 USBs. And if you're going to run, like I did, something like Unraid, you're going to lose one of those USBs very early doors. So, nice idea. I kind of would have liked to have seen that integrated anyway. When we talk about the SSDs and heat generation, by the way, reaching high heats isn't going to be as much of a problem. I will say that when we had this running, we've been running 3 individual VMs and doing some read and write transfers onto each of the individual disks. We'll talk about it later. This thing only hit about 40 degrees peak, and that was when the CPU was hitting 60 to 70% utilization. And again, thanks again to HIC Micro for supplying us with our thermal camera to allow us to see a lot of that information there on screen. Hopefully you can see, but I'm going to say I expected it to be much, much hotter, and indeed when we were digging into the individual SSD temperatures, we didn't really see it going that much above 40, which is great given the throttle point is way, way higher at 70. Indeed, the bulk of the weight of this thing, it weighs in at about 1.2 kilograms, is the top-mounted heatsink and that base level heatsink over the CPU there. That's really it. And even at 1.2 kilos, once you add these, 4 of those, which realistically weigh nothing, you're looking at a very portable system. One thing I will say in terms of portability, however, one of the cardinal sins, and we talked about this in another video, it's using a barrel. It's utilizing the barrel input there. Now, I get it. Barrel, it's cheaper to implement there. They've probably got lots of PSU. You can go to something like HuntKey and get a decent external PSU. And indeed, this doesn't need that much power. It arrives with a built-in combined wall-mounted PSU there that goes straight into the barrel. And this one, I believe, was 60 watt. Yep, it's a 60 watt to utilize there. But that was an open goal to integrate something like USB-C. We talked, again, as mentioned, in the previous video when I talked about USB-C inputs, one helpful commenter did highlight that a lot of the reasons that some manufacturers don't integrate USB Type-C into their systems is due to irregular power delivery there. But there are decent enough external PSUs with USB-C output that resolved that problem. And I think this was an open goal that unfortunately was missed. But regardless of the power delivery system, why don't we talk about power utilization? Now, the CPU itself has a reported general utilization of 15 watt TDP. How did that translate in utilization? Well, when I had the system with 4 M.2 NVMe's and 2 SATA SSDs, we'll talk about that later on, connected to this system, it utilized around 18 watts during idle, and that was with the array completely dismounted. So 18 watts is a little higher than I thought it would be, but given the 8-core N355 CPU, I think that's comparable there. Now, when we had all 4 SSDs being accessed simultaneously, so the CPU would bounce at around 30, maybe 40% utilization, it went up to about 31 to 32 watts there. Finally, when we had 3 Windows VMs, each running with their own individual vCPU and 2 gig of memory, all of them running simultaneously and SSD being accessed, we saw utilization hit 34 to 35 watts. Sorry, I've got a horrific cold today. Bottom line, for a compact 4-bay flash NAS system, I'm really happy with those numbers, given the CPU profile we've got to deal with here. And when it came to noise, when the system was utilized, when we went ahead with both the VM and the read-write actions on this system, with the base fan activated, it seemed like pretty much the highest it would go, and the connected fan not attached, we saw audio levels at 35 to 36 dBA there. Indeed, with a recording that I made, unfortunately, just outside my office, some people were playing music and they would not stop. So I apologize if you hear that bass level at the background. But moving off the subject of noise and onto the M.2 NVMe slots inside, I want to talk about why in the course of this video, you've been hearing that rattling noise now. Now that is that this system doesn't currently have the M.2 NVMe's installed inside there. However, as you can see from the guidelines there, that heatsink, there's clearly a gap between them because of the SSDs not being installed. But what about your thermal pads? Well, I say right now, these are the most pathetic thermal pads I have ever received with any NAS I have ever reviewed. Look at the thinness there. Now, one could argue there is not a lot of space to play with there, and they have provided these guidelines there. But I used fairly average and slightly thicker heat pads that I already had in stock during the course of my testing, hence why these ones are still sealed, and they work just as fine, and the lid connected beautifully there. So again, I understand there are economies perhaps to be made, and these no doubt do still connect, and maybe there is an element of expansion where these are on there. But seriously, these thermal pads, pretty sad. But do you remember earlier I mentioned about SATA drives? That's right, you've got the 4x M.2 NVMe bays in there, but you've got the option to add some SATA storage there, technically. Now I'm going to do a follow-up video on it because I didn't have that much success based on my own setup there, but it arrives with these JFPC1 adapter cables. These connect a ribbon cable there, which hopefully you can see there on screen, directly into a combined SATA and data. I got them connected and the drives did register. However, I could not get the drives to be recognized. Now I went into the BIOS there, I could see SATA port control, but I didn't have a lot of time to do that during the rest of my testing because I am working on a very similar product to this for a video coming out next week. Consequently, I am going to be coming back to these little SATA adapters. Now, I would argue no one's buying this solution for these. Hell, there's a reason that CWWK on all of their listings barely mention these. I'm glad they're included, but I'm still going to dig a little bit more into these adapter cables here because I want to see just how useful they are. We've seen things like on the Zimmer Blade and the Zimmer board that had something similar to this, but given this system has no physical SATA outputs and space is pretty limited in there, I understand how this serves as a great way to include additional storage, but I'm going to have to learn more about them. But let's talk more about the individual M.2 NVMe slots there. 2280 length, all 4 of them there. There are no screw holes for shorter M.2 NVMe's in there. There's also internally an M key slot there for a Wi-Fi adapter. And although there is mention in some places of this device, I hate SEAGULLS, with M.2 Wi-Fi keys installed, this did not include it. And from what I could see on the official pages, it does not arrive with either a Wi-Fi adapter included or the necessary antennae cables to go inside there. There are diagrams for it, but this did not include it. So double check if you are going to use it as some kind of failover, whether that's there. And obviously your NAS OS of choice will be a factor. However, the M.2 NVMe's inside here are, unsurprisingly, ×1 speed. Gen 3 ×1, each of them. Again, it's a very efficient CPU. It's not the first time we've seen this CPU profile or even the previous generation Alder Lake rock out with ×1 speeds. Slight difference, I would argue, though. These do feed into a singular M.2 inside. This 4-bay board feeds into a single 40-pin adapter-equipped M.2, which then feeds into the internal micro board inside there. Because it's all feeding into that little board, the need for a PCIe packet switch in the middle was debatable, at least as far as CWWK are concerned there. But each of the individual M.2s, when I did 1 by 1 read and write operations there, 1 gig repeated, 1 gigabyte 100 times test file, I saw around 780 to 790 megabytes per second read at about 690 megabytes per second write there. Again, not ideal, given that each of these are 3 times 1, so you're looking at around the 800 megabytes per second bandwidth for each of them there. It's about what I would have expected, but just keep your expectations realistic on this. Now, the port and connectivity on this, framing it in mind of the price tag and the profile, we're going to have some give and take with CWWK about this. What do I mean? Well, on the back here, 2.5 GBE, so we've got a couple of them there. Yes, SMB multi-channel, lag, port trunking, that sort of thing. You can obviously bump that up to about 550 megs, 579 megs if you're lucky, but there's no 10 GBE. And I do know that much like the previous generation Alder Lake Mobos, the N100 and N305, where they had 10 GBE equipped alternatives, I'm just waiting for them to not only profile these little mini NASs with 10 GBE where possible, especially if you're going to have that kind of flow there at the top, but also the idea that alongside that, that N355 CPU will hopefully do a better job of saturating 10 GBE where possible. You may have to forsake one of these M.2s. I hope that doesn't happen, but I think that might be the only way it can. But alongside that, we've got the 2 USBs I mentioned, and of course, HDMI outputs there. We've got 2 HDMI outputs there, twin screen, mirror screen, extended screen, that sort of stuff. But just keep in mind that if you are prepared to forsake one of your M.2s, if you're not already aware, and we've talked about it at length on the channel, you can get M.2 to 10 GBE adapters to add 10 GBE to this if you choose. You can get M.2 to PCIe adapters if you want to add a PCIe upgrade card there. And of course, if you really want to get advanced, which for this CPU seems a bit bonkers, you've got M.2 to Oculink adapters as well. So yes, the port and connection on this, frankly, are pretty dull, but at the same time, if you are prepared to give up one of those M.2s, you got options. Seriously, you hearing that? They're back. But let's dig into that CPU a little bit there. We're going to focus on the N355 version because 1, it's the one that I've got here on the table, but 2, if given the price difference between them of about 100 to 115 nicker, I would recommend everyone to go for the N355 version anyway. Now, again, it's an 8-core, 8-thread processor, 50-watt TDP. I think it goes as low as 10 watt during their own reported idle at Intel. It might be 8 watt, apologies. Alongside that, it goes up to a peak 3.9 gigahertz. Keep in mind, that's not the general utilization. It's only when it needs that across the 8 cores, and 1.3 gigahertz graphical capabilities as well with that integrated graphics there. So pretty good stuff. Again, it is a 9-lane CPU. Obviously, stuff like ECC memory is off the table. There's a single SODIMM slot inside. If you do shop your AliExpress, your Amazon, your direct to CWWK, you've got the option there to add SSDs and memory if you choose to, and obviously that will reflect on the price. But the base level model there for 315 for that kind of hardware profile, it's not bad at all. And that SODIMM slot there goes up to 48 gig if you need it, but just keep in mind it is a single module there. Again, there's going to be people looking at a flash server that doesn't have ECC. I get it. But again, think of the price point there. Now, in terms of testing, that's another part that's going to be a part of our follow-up video, but to quickly address it all there, again, we've already done the MG testing earlier on, but when it came to things like with VMs, I wanted to see when what crunch point did using virtual machines on this become problematic, and we ran 3 Windows 10 VMs simultaneously, and with all 3 of those running, again, each with just 1 core and 2 gig of memory, I was still only utilizing just under half of the CPU utilization. Again, you can see it there, hopefully on screen in unrate there with each of the assigned cores. And I was still able to access a lot of the CPU and memory and even do some Plex testing. When it came to the Plex testing, I tested a 100 megabit 1080p file, ran like a charm. Then I went into 4K, and that was a 60 megabit HEVC file, ran like a charm. And then I went with 8K, all ran like a charm. Again, we'll do a bunch of dedicated stuff there later on in the next follow-up video. But ultimately, overall, when we're seeing the performance of this for the price point, it's really hard to argue with it. And the main concern I think most users are always going to have with a NAS like this is heat. It's going to be heat generation. And given the whole thing, that hurt, is metal on practically every side. I think the base panel, is that metal? Oh, it is metal as well. The whole thing is completely metal. Dissipation alongside that fan and the additional fan included, I'm not going to say is not a worry, but I'm going to say is largely avoided in terms of long-term use. Obviously, you're going to have to think about where you deploy it, because when you are going to be having heat being dissipated off that top panel there, where's it going to go? But ultimately, as a micro NAS, there's a 4-bay flash, I really can't fault what I'm seeing here. As long as you keep your expectations realistic, I think you're really going to like this. I do wonder about the scalability of something like this. Again, those ports and connections are pretty blah. And I'm not completely in love with the way they've addressed the SATA cable stuff here. Again, I get why they've done it. Space is pretty much non-existent here inside this, so better this than nothing. But once you try and factor in scalability, you are then going to have to think about things like hard drive cages to put that drive in, which this is going to live on top of. If you're going to use something like that Unify NAS that we talked about, that 10 GBE kind of 499 large-scale storage server, and you wanted a small device to live with it for your containers, for your VMs, for your more complex procedures, this is pretty bloody ideal. But what do you guys think? Have you got hold of one of these already, or maybe the previous generation micro NAS? I believe that was called the P5. Let me know what you think in the comments. Hopefully the written review will be live in the next day or so. If it is, it will be linked below, along with little links where you can get hold of this device for yourself. Obviously, if you found the video helpful and if you were going to go to those shops anyway, make sure those 2 things are true. Using those links will result in a small commission to me and Eddie here at NAS Compares. It allows us to keep doing what we do. This unit was supplied by CWWK. They've not paid for the video. They've got no control over the video. They've just supplied it. All these thoughts are my own, etc., etc. But let me know what you think, and hold out for the next video if you can, where we'll be digging a little bit more into the capabilities of that storage there. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I've got a rotten cold and I'm going to go sneeze my head off. I'll see you next time.